Okay, good. Let's start. So we're resuming our colloquium with a session of contributed papers. And we'll start with Hicham Jahka, who who is a PhD candidate from Katolicki Universitet Lubelski, Jana Pawła II in Poland. I hope I pronounced that right. And so thank you, Hicham, for submitting your paper, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I assume everyone can hear me and see my presentation, right? Okay, so thank you once again for giving me the opportunity to present my work here. This is still very much work in progress, so I'd very much like to hear your remarks and receive some feedback from you. So this is based on a paper that I'm currently working on entitled Ficta's Dependencies on Mental Acts and Works of Art, an Ingardenian examination of Amy Thomasson's Artifactual Dependencies. And as you know, one of the main debates pertaining to the problem of fictional entities is centered around their dependencies. Philosophers who postulate Ficta's existence attempt to formulate dependence systems that account for Ficta's relations to inter alia, the fictional works that contain them, and the creative acts of authors that bring them into existence. And a prominent contemporary account of Ficta's dependencies has been put forth by the American philosopher Amy Thomasson. In her Fiction and Metaphysics, published in 1999, Thomasson outlines an artifactual theory of Ficta where they are depicted as cultural artifacts. So because they share the same ontological status with artifacts, Ficta's dependencies are no different than those obtained among artifacts. So it is safe to say that dependence is key in Thomasson's account. So let me just delve deeper into that. So in addition to being artifacts, Ficta are also dependent entities. That is, Ficta depend on other entities for their origination and subsistence. The criterion that Thomasson devises to advance her account of dependence is existence. So in other words, necessarily, oh, sorry, I thought that I was moving my presentation. So the criterion that Thomasson devises to advance her account of dependence is existence. So necessarily, if A exists, then B exists. This conditional seems to place a useful, necessary condition for A depending on B, as Thomasson writes. So this is modal dependence, and I have a remark about this modal dependence, but it's still very much it's not worked properly and still probably needs some argument, and is that modal dependence, as you know, entails that an entity is necessarily dependent on an entity, for example, B, in all possible worlds. So this necessary dependence is a bit tricky for me, because if, for example, if you take necessary entities like, for example, numbers, and you take number 1, and I think that Thomasson would suggest that, for example, Sherlock Holmes depends on the number 1, and I think that would be a bit problematic. Okay, so Thomasson has broken dependence into more concentrated variants. So we have constant dependence, historical dependence, rigid dependence, and generic dependence. An entity A is constantly dependent on entity B, entails that B must exist at every time which A exists. And an entity A is historically dependent on an entity B, entails that B must exist prior to, or at least at a time coincident with A's existing. Rigid dependence obtains when an entity A is dependent on a particular individual B, and generic dependence obtains when an entity A is dependent on something or other of a particular type B. So now let's move to Thomasson's Ficta. A fictum, Thomasson upholds, is also an abstract entity in the sense that it is non-spatiotemporal and causally inefficacious. We can't really meet Sherlock anywhere, anytime. And Sherlock can't really cause anything in the real world. But of course, this is controversial, I would say, because we have this so-called paradox of fiction, which explores the possibility of fictional instances forcing the reader into an emotional engagement, so to speak, with characters and their plights, happiness, etc. So this, some people would say that this is causally inefficacious. It is important to note, however, that this is not the same abstractness that is attributed to Ficta by Neo-Meinongians, for example. Thomasson places Ficta in the category of bound idealities, as Husserl would have it. These are abstract entities whose existence depends on other entities. And as I said, if we contrast this to the Meinongian or Neo-Meinongian view, Meinongian abstracta would be accommodated in the Husserlian realm of free idealities. So Thomasson here places her artifactualia in the domain or under the category of bound idealities. A fictum is a dependent abstract artifact. It is abstract in the sense that I just mentioned, namely that it is a bound ideality whose existence is bound to the existence of a particular mental act preceding its creation. And here we have historical dependence plus rigid dependence and the constant existence of some literary work that would ensure its subsistence. So here we have constant dependence plus generic dependence. As I outlined in the abstract for this talk, one of the main problems that Thomasson's artifactual account of Ficta raises has to do with its ability to convincingly defend the very idea that Ficta are abstract artifacts, and to pinpoint the inadequacies of Thomasson's account artifactual dependencies on account of artifactual dependencies on mental acts and works of art. I will rely on a phenomenological corpus borrowed from the Polish philosopher Roman Ingardenian. As Thomasson admits in her book, Ingardenian's account of fictional entities is the true historical predecessor of the theory here defended. Ingardenian defends a view of Ficta as purely intentional objects. This is also the starting point of Thomasson's analysis. Her artifactual theory of Ficta can be reduced to the basic claim that Ficta are a subset of intentionalia. This is apparent in her assertion that there is a rigid historical dependence between particular mental acts and Ficta. And intentionality becomes a fictum insofar as it is protracted, that is, insofar as it is maintained after its origination by some literary work. And here I borrow this term protraction from Alberto Voltolini. So let us proceed in the same way that Voltolini does in his book, How Ficta Follow Fiction, because I borrow his arguments against Thomasson's artifactual account. So what Thomasson seems to suggest is that a fictum is distinguishable from a purely intentional entity by virtue of the former's protraction, that is, continuation in some literary work. Of course, this distinction is only applicable to Brentanian intentionalia. Ingardenian formulated a theory of Ficta in which the immediate dependence on a conscious mental act is replaced by an immediate dependence on sentences and words, thanks to their borrowed intentionality, as he called it in his book, The Literary Work of Art, which consequently marks the independence of Ficta as pure intentionalia from consciousness. But how can this form of dependence guarantee Ficta's artifactuality and not say their culturality, as Voltolini argues? This is one of the main challenges that Thomasson's theory faces. And the two available hypotheses here are that one, a fictum, if it were an artifact, must be so from its very beginning, but this is not the case. A fictum starts its life or comes into life as a purely intentional entity. Second hypothesis, a fictum, if it were an artifact, must be so from its origination. Hence, protraction can't guarantee both its origination and persistence. And to avert this difficulty, Thomasson has conceded that what lies underneath Ficta's generation may be something along the lines of a storytelling process. So talking in terms of creative storytelling processes rather than acts certainly explains better Ficta's generation, but while this is helpful with regards to Ficta's generation, it has nothing to show for Ficta's artifactuality, as Voltolini proceeds later on in his book. So let me elaborate here. An artifact is an entity constructed intentionally. It's assemblage of building blocks, again, from Voltolini, must be constructed intentionally. A fictim's properties, according to Thomasson's relative, non-relative distinction, are only attributable relatively, that is, relative to the story narration. And it is not exactly clear how a storytelling process can guarantee the artifactuality of a fictim whose assemblage of building blocks, the properties attributed to it within the narrative, can only be attributed relatively. And in response, it can be argued that a fictim's artifactuality is embedded in the constructive intention lying behind it. In other words, an object is regarded as an artifact insofar as it fulfills a certain function that it was externally intended to fulfill. And this is especially manifest in the case of concrete artifacts, for example, chairs, tables. You can easily and clearly attribute a certain function to these concrete artifacts. However, when it comes to abstract artifacts, like Ficta, it is not clear. It is not easy to determine the exact function that they were designed to fulfill. In short, changing these dependencies of Ficta from a rigid historical dependence on mental acts to a rigid historical dependence on cultural processes does not do sufficiently well to explain their artifactuality, which consequently undermines the core idea of Thomasson's theory. And let me now process the aforementioned arguments through Ingarden's theory, or Ingarden's ontology. The first argument was, if a fictim is an artifact, it must be so from its very beginning. But a fictim, as I said, comes to life as a purely intentional entity at first. So it can't be an artifact. What Thomasson means by a purely intentional entity goes along Brentanian lines, namely that it is constantly dependent on a conscious mental act. And once that act ceases to exist, the entity ceases to exist. This is also similar to Sartre's theory of Ficta's imaginary objects. Ingarden argued for a different version of intentionality. According to him, Ficta are purely intentional objects, but they are not constantly dependent on the conscious mental acts that first brought them to light. And in this regard, perhaps a brief footnote is in order. Ingarden also made a distinction between purely private intentional objects and what, for example, Voltolini would call protracted intentional objects. And I can think about anything, for example, but unless I write about this in a book or in manuscript or anything, what I think about is a purely private intentional entity. It is accessible only privately to me. And purely private intentional objects become intersubjectively accessible objects following their protraction. So it is safe to say that all intentional objects, so to speak, start their lives as purely private intentional objects, but not all private intentional objects make it to the intersubjective level. Some entities get stuck, or perhaps die out would be a better term to put it, on the intrasubjective level. An author brings Ficta to life first by their creative mental acts, then Ficta become dependent on the words and sentences of the works that contain them, for they possess what Ingarden calls borrowed intentionality. So Ingarden's account successfully explains both Ficta's origination as pure intentionalia and Ficta's dependence on literary works. And to elaborate, it would be helpful to sketch out Ingarden's system of dependencies. A fictum, like all pure intentionalia, is existentially heteronymous, for its existential foundation lies outside of itself, as Ingardenian writes. So here we have dependence variant, or as Ingardenian would call it, an existential moment, which is heteronomy. And that is a fictum. What I mean here is, and what Ingardenian means is that a fictum does not have the fundament for its being in itself. The fundament for its being lies in the creative acts of its creator, which these acts are themselves existentially autonomous. That is, they have their existential foundation within themselves. Perhaps another point of clarification is in order here. Existential foundation should be in contradistinction with physical base. So the physical base of an artwork is only there to help recreate, for example, Sherlock. And books only help us to recreate Sherlock, but they do not constitute Sherlock's existential foundation. They only represent Sherlock and his story. So that would be an accurate representation of Ingardenian's account of heteronomy. So Ingardenian delved deeper and distinguished two senses of foundation to explain Ficta's dependencies. Two senses of foundation to explain Ficta's dependencies on works of art. So on the one hand, Ficta have their immediate existential foundation in the sentences and propositions that contain their descriptions. And on the other hand, sentences have their immediate foundation in the creative acts of authors, and this is what constitutes their derivative existential foundation. So depicted as such, Ficta's intentionality becomes linked to literary works by sentence forming operations, which consequently does away with Thomasson's historical constant dependence on mental acts. So this form of dependence is indeed very similar to Thomasson's storytelling operations. It can be argued that sentence forming operations are the natural step that follows storytelling operations, provided that the latter are only oral. However, as Voltolini argues, explaining Ficta's origination in terms of storytelling processes, while favorable in many respects, does not explain their origination, or does not explain their artifactuality. On the contrary, storytelling processes, I argue, serve more their pure intentionality, understood in an Ingardenian sense. So the storytelling processes, like sentence forming operations, are purely intentional. On the one hand, they have their immediate existential foundation in the creative acts of authors, which are themselves existentially autonomous. On the other hand, the Ficta that are generated following storytelling processes have their derivative foundation in those very processes. So this is especially manifest when considering Ingardenian's ontological rule, namely that all heteronymous entities, for example, sentence forming operations, Ficta, etc., are reducible to an autonomous entity, for example, the conscious acts of an author. So it is important to note, however, that not all heteronymous entities are immediately dependent on an autonomous one. For instance, Ficta are immediately dependent on sentence forming operations, which are then dependent on autonomous conscious acts. So here we have a transitivity in place. So put briefly, and just to close my talk, the heteronymous storytelling processes that bring about Ficta are themselves reducible to or dependent on autonomous conscious mind. That is, this is, I argue, what explains Ficta's origination as purely intentional entities rather than abstract artifacts. And here are the references that I use for this talk, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Hicham. So we can start the Q&A. Yes, we have a question from Alberto.
Yes, thank you very much for this very clear presentation and confrontation between Thomasson and Ingardenian's ideas. One of the reasons that I took it that the simple idea that protraction does not manage to transform a purely intentional object into a sort of artifact, abstract artifact, as Thomasson thinks, is that similar cases might be involved, for instance, in the Geach's puzzle about intentional identity, in which there seems to be a situation in which different thinkers at different times share one and the same intentional object by possibly ascribing to it different properties, and still nothing in that process makes it the case that such an intentional object, or such a focus, common focus, as Geach originally said, is anything like an artifact or a fictum. So definitely there must be something more that has probably to do with the function that is involved in the storytelling process that enables to perform this sort of transformation. So I would like to know your reactions about that.
So you mean that artifactuality can be placed somewhere within storytelling processes, right? I think I would agree with the core idea underlying it. But as I argued, for example, here in my talk, even these storytelling processes are in themselves purely intentional. So they can be reduced to, for example, the mental acts of authors, or, for example, storytelling, I don't know, orators, or I don't know, people in general, if they do not write these stories down in a book or in a manuscript or something. So these, I would say, the pure intentionality of storytelling processes is ontologically prior to their artifactuality, I would say. So for me here, these storytelling processes are, as artifacts, can be done away with. So it's for me, it's obsolete, because at first they come as purely intentional entities. So for example, even these storytelling processes, if they lead to stories and books, and as Thomasson, for example, seems to suggest that even if you kill all the people in the world and these books survive, Ficta also survive, because they have this dependence on literary works. But I would say no, because books themselves are purely intentional, and they have meanings, they have sentences, and only competent readers, competent minds can decipher these sentences that are contained in Sherlock. So unless we have these competent readers who are able to decipher the meanings of the books, Ficta would cease to exist. So again, I would reduce them to the pure intentionality. And for me, I regard pure intentionality as the ontological foundation, so to speak, of literary works of Ficta that comes prior to their artifactuality. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, I have a question, but if anyone else has a question, can go before me. No? Okay. So I think I just would like to know, to clarify, if you could clarify how much you are committed to the argument about function, that artifacts must have function. I guess it's not very clear to me, because we can certainly make artifacts without functions, and certainly in the case of functions that we ascribe to some even biological structures, the functions can come after the fact, after they're created, so to speak, in an evolutionary sense. It's the case of the phenomenon of exaptation in evolution, in which a structure emerges from a totally unrelated reason and then gets adopted into performing a particular function totally unrelated to its origin. So I would say that function is to say that characters do not have functions is insufficient to say that they're not artifacts.
Yeah, but then if we follow your line of reasoning, that means that artifacts come into existence later in the process of their existence. So first they start as something else. For example, you said that they're not artifacts, but then later they become artifacts. So here, as maybe like you're answering yourself, that their origination does not line up with their artifactuality. So they start as something else. And my argument is that they start as purely intentional objects. And of course, later they can become artifacts. But what I'm saying is that their intentionality is ontologically prior to their artifactuality. And about your point about function, I think it's very important to ascribe a function to an artifact. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an artifact, I think, because an artifact is intentionally constructed and it is ascribed a function. So, for example, a chair is there to sit on, a table is there to put things on. And so this is what gives them their intentionality. So I would say function is very important. And when it comes to abstract artifacts, as I told you, like, for example, Thomasson thinks that Ficta are abstract artifacts. And again, as Voltolini said in his book, it is not exactly clear what this function is when it comes to abstract entities.
Okay, great, thanks. Nate?
Thank you, Hicham, for a very interesting talk. I wanted to pick up on your response to Alberto's question. If I understand you correctly, your view is that if all speakers or minded beings cease to exist, even though there are texts written by such beings, then there would be no ficta. So I'm wondering, does that localize to individual languages? So suppose before the Rosetta Stone was discovered and we had a means of translating Egyptian hieroglyphics, does that mean that ficta established by Egyptian writers used to exist, and then they stopped existing, and then they popped back into existence once the discovery of the Rosetta Stone happened? And what about other languages that have no current speakers? Do they have no recourse to ficta, but they did at one point? And don't you want to say maybe that it's more like a dispositional account? It's something like if readers or speakers could understand, rather than if they actually do or if there actually are.
Yeah, so I would agree with you. I would say that this competency is key here. So if we have competent people who can decipher these sentences or, I don't know, propositions in a certain work. So if we don't have these people, I would still be inclined to say that, for example, fictional entities created by the ancient Egyptians before anyone could decipher the symbols of, in their language, I would say that maybe those fictional entities cease to exist, because, as I said, I would still reduce them to the intentionality underlying them. And I know that this is problematic, but they, flit in and out of existence, for example, as Thomasson says, and it is problematic, I agree. But still, I think it's less problematic than saying that ficta can exist even if there is no one who can read or decipher the meaning.
A quick follow-up question. How would a historian describe a work of Egyptian literature? Say the historian did not have access to the hieroglyphics, or did not know how to translate, but had some vague idea. Would the historian say Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom period believed in gods, or wrote stories about gods, or could the historian not even say that?
No, I think they could, because this, I think that the burden of understanding, of deciphering this, lies on the historians, for example, not of the people. So we can't really rule out that what all people wrote, that these things don't exist. So I would just say that these people, once they acquire the tools to decipher these languages, they get access to these works. But when it comes to their strictly ontological status, I would say that I'm talking here about fictional entities, of course, but not like things that happened and they just wrote about them. They, I would say, no one was there to understand them. So they would have at least a weaker ontological status than if people were there, like, and were able to competently read and decipher these signs. I hope that it makes sense.
Okay, thank you very much, Hicham. Thank you again
Thank
for
you
your
very much.
talk.
Thank you.
Let's just start sharing here. Okay, so let's move on with our own presentation. Italo.
Let's do it. So good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or maybe good morning, you never know. My name is Italo Lemos. I defended my PhD 2 years ago at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. And along with Professor Jerzy Brzozowski, we're going to deliver a conference or a presentation entitled An Inferentialist Solution to the Problem of Assigning Properties to Fictional Objects. So our presentation is divided in 5 parts. In the first part, we're going to present our background assumptions on the metaphysics of fiction. In the second part, we're going to talk about the basic vocabulary in the semantics of fiction. And only then, in section 3, we're going to raise the problem. But I can already anticipate that it has something to do with the kinds of properties that a fictional object can exemplify. And then we're going to talk in section 4 about 3 kinds of theories that try to deal with this problem. And finally, only in section 5, and then Jerzy is going to talk about that, we're going to present our own account that has something to do with modifying adjectives. All right, so let's start from the beginning. So when it comes to the metaphysics of fiction, we assume a realist approach, or more specifically, an artifactualist approach, the same as Amy Thomasson's, the same approach that she argued for in her 1999 book, Fiction and Metaphysics. And we are taking for granted that fictional objects are abstract artifacts. They are artifacts because they are created by an author through his or her intentional acts, and they are abstract because they lack spatial temporal location and can't have causal interactions with other objects in the empirical world. So this is our realist background assumptions. Right, and when it comes to the vocabulary, we're going to talk about a vocabulary that was mentioned by François Recanati, but also was introduced by Bonomi and Professor Voltolini. And it's a vocabulary that distinguishes 3 kinds of utterances when it comes to fiction. First, we have fictional utterances that are those performed in a fictional context. For example, if you read Crime and Punishment from Dostoevsky, you're going to find such an utterance like, number 1, I am Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, formerly a student. I live in Chill's house, not far from here, flat number 14. If the utterance occurs in fiction, we might call it a fictional utterance. But we also have 2 other kinds of utterances that are metafictional utterances and parafictional utterances. But let's talk about metafictional utterances first. These are those performed in a non-fictional context, and they take fictional objects as fictional objects. So we have utterance number 2 that says, Raskolnikov is a fictional character created by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and if that utterance is performed outside of a fictional context, but is preceded by a prefix or sentence operator equivalent to according to the story, then we have a parafictional utterance. For example, utterance number 3, according to Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov is a murderer. So fictional utterances occur inside the work of fiction. Metafictional and parafictional utterances occur outside the work of fiction, but parafictional utterances are preceded implicitly or explicitly by a prefix equivalent to according to the story. All right, now let's tackle the problem. The problem is as follows. Let's analyze the following utterances. In utterance number 4, we have Rodion Raskolnikov is a murderer. And in utterance number 5, we have Rodion Raskolnikov is a fictional murderer. Our intuition in this presentation is to say that sentence or utterance number 4 is false. Fictional characters can't do such things as murder someone else. And the reason why they can do such a thing is because they are abstract artifacts. How can an abstract artifact be said to murder someone if abstract objects establish no causal interactions? Raskolnikov can kill anyone because it is abstract. On the other hand, sentences like number 5 are taken to be true. We want to say that it is true that Rodion Raskolnikov is a fictional murderer. But what does fictional mean here? That is the problem we're trying to raise. So what kinds of properties can be attributed to a fictional character? We are saying that Raskolnikov is a fictional murderer, but it is not a murderer. We want to say that Sherlock Holmes is a fictional detective, but it is not a detective. All right. There are a lot of theories that try to deal with this problem. We're going to mention a couple of them. More specifically, we're going to mention 3 theories. The first is the pure pretense or make-believe theories, then the hybrid theories, and then the pure referential theories. Let's talk a little bit about pure pretense theories. All right, so this is Kendall Walton, the author of Mimesis as Make-Believe, a really influential book that was published in 1990. And according to pure pretense and make-believe theories, neither the author of fiction nor the readers or critics make serious assertions about fictional objects. After all, fictional objects don't exist. We only pretend or make believe to perform those utterances. Given that this is an anti-realist account, we are to say that Sherlock Holmes, according to the theory, is not a detective because Sherlock Holmes does not exist. And the name Sherlock Holmes is just an empty name. Previously, we have argued against this kind of pure make-believe theory, but in this presentation, we're going to deal with only one reason why maybe we shouldn't take this approach for granted. Only one reason, but of course, we're not presenting some sort of argument in order to say that make-believe theory is nonsense or anything like that. It's just one motivation. And the problem is that metafictional utterances are definitely serious assertions. So if we take utterance number 2 as an example, again, Raskolnikov is a fictional character created by Fyodor Dostoevsky. We don't mean to say that we are pretending when we say such a thing. Even if you are an anti-realist, you have to consider that Sherlock Holmes really is a fictional character. So there's no pretense involved. Of course, Kendall Walton argued that it is a part of an ad hoc game of make-believe. We're not going to talk about that right now. It's just a motivation for us to say that maybe there's something off in this analysis. All right. So the second kind of theory are the hybrid theories, which was developed by Amy Thomasson, not exactly in her 1999 book, Fiction and Metaphysics, but more specifically in her 2003 paper entitled Speaking of Fictional Characters. And according to fiction only pretends or makes believe to perform fictional utterances, but metafictional utterances are performed seriously. And here we also may have another problem of anaphora. So the question is, according to the hybrid theories, are there 2 fictional proper names? Let's see why am I raising this question. All right, so anaphora. We have utterance number 6 that says, Immanuel Kant was a great philosopher. He wrote the Critique of Pure Reason. The proper name, Immanuel Kant, and the pronoun he co-refer. It is a classic case of anaphora. But if we talk about fiction, and if we sort of mix fictional utterances with metafictional utterances, we may have an utterance like 7. Raskolnikov lives in Chill's house. He is a fictional character created by Dostoevsky. However, the first part of the utterance, Raskolnikov lives in Chill's house, is a fictional utterance, which means it is only a pretended utterance, which means that Raskolnikov is just an empty name. However, the pronoun he in utterance number 7 is supposed to refer to Raskolnikov as an abstract artifact. So do we have 2 sorts of names when it comes to fiction? And how can we really say that the pronoun he or any fictional proper name that is used in metafictional and parafictional utterances refer to a fictional character if they depend on the story that was written about that character, meaning it depends on fictional utterances. Again, we have another kind of theory, which is, we're calling here a pure referential theory that was developed by Peter van Inwagen in his 1977 paper, Creatures of Fiction. And according to pure referential theories, fictional proper names and pronouns, etc., refer to fictional objects in all kinds of utterances, fictional, metafictional, and parafictional. In this case, more specifically, there are two modes of predication. According to Inwagen, a fictional object holds, or according to Zauta, encodes, the properties that are attributed to them in the fictional context. So according to a pure referential theory, Sherlock Holmes holds or encodes the property of being a detective. Or again, Raskolnikov holds or encodes the property of being a murderer. And on the other hand, a fictional object has or exemplifies the properties that are attributed to them outside the fictional context. In other words, according to this account, Sherlock Holmes has or exemplifies the property of being a fictional character, and Raskolnikov has or exemplifies the property of being a murderer. Even though this account is really neat and smooth, and I think it explains what we want to explain, the problem is that it sounds ad hoc, given that we don't have a linguistic basis for us to distinguish two modes of predication, or in another version of the argument, like in Terence Parsons' 1980 book, Non-Existent Objects. I don't think we have reasons to say that in our daily communication, we have two kinds of predication, or two kinds of properties, according to Parsons, like nuclear and extranuclear properties. However, we want to take for granted that pure referential theories are the path we want to follow. And in this sense, we're going to put forward our own perspective, and hopefully it will work. So, Jerzy?
Okay, so to illustrate the sort of purported commitment to the holding distinction that the realist must face, here's an example from the literature. Von Solotkov and Woodward, in a recent paper, argue that realists must commit to the distinction, or to a version of the distinction, but that the distinction doesn't have a semantic basis, is not cannot be related to a semantic ambiguity of the copula. And in that papers, von Solotkov and Woodward argue that the to hold version, the to hold part of the distinction, is explainable away as an ellipsis occurring at the level of syntax. Well, we want to take that cue, but we want to reject the first part of the argument, the one that says that realists must commit to the distinction. So our account would be a purely referential realism that doesn't rely on the distinction, a realism without holding, so to speak. So when we talk about fictional characters, as Sam was saying this morning, they have very little to them. They are very thin entities, so to speak. Let's pretend, without getting into pretense theories, but let's say that this green rectangle here is Sherlock Holmes. According to the rival account, he has two dimensions, so to speak. He has a holding dimension. He holds, perhaps close to his heart, the property of being a detective. And on the other hand, he has the property of having been created by Conan Doyle. We want to flatten things out here. We want to say that Sherlock Holmes is a single-dimensional character, and say that he only has both the property of having been created by Conan Doyle and the property of being a fictional detective. And this will happen with recourse to the theory of modifying adjectives. So why do we call our solution an inferentialist solution? Because well, we are assuming more or less a Brandomian framework in which we have to map out discursive commitments, and those discursive commitments are inferentially articulated. We have to look for what counts as evidence for them, what they commit us to, and what other commitments they are incompatible with. So, for example, let's try to map out the inferential chain that is related to those metafictional and parafictional utterances that we can make about Sherlock Holmes. Okay, so Sherlock Holmes itself is a fictional character, we believe. It originated with Study in Scarlet. There's the whole discussion that Sam was talking about this morning, that the origin may be something fuzzy, it may be something vague, but okay, let's assume that it's not indeterminate in any serious way, just to simplify stuff here. So we can say that the metafictional utterances we can make about Sherlock Holmes, in the sense of ascribing properties to him qua a fictional object, are inferentially granted. Inferentially, the evidence for them comes from the very norms of fiction and the very institution of fiction making. Whereas the more difficult, the holding part of things, the properties, the fictional properties, they are a little bit trickier. We have to say that the content of the work is the one that provides the evidence for the discursive commitment to ascribing this fictional property. But nonetheless, we can say that there is such a thing. We can rely on this evidence for saying that Sherlock Holmes is a fictional detective. Continuing the chain of reasoning here, the chain of inferences, we can say that this commitment, in turn, precludes at the metaphysical level. We're talking about Sherlock Holmes as a metaphysical object. At the metaphysical object, it would, strictly speaking, preclude the entitlement to saying that Sherlock Holmes has the property of being a detective. And that's why Italo was saying that Raskolnikov is a murderer is, strictly speaking, false, because at the metaphysical level, this sentence is false. Just like the sentence that Sherlock Holmes is a fictional unicorn, for example, is also false, both at the metaphysical and at other levels. We have a sort of pragmatic entitlement to saying that Sherlock Holmes is a detective. We can say this as an elliptical sentence that really is saying Sherlock Holmes is a fictional detective. That's more or less von Solodkov and Woodward's paper. So this should be reread as syntactically elliptical, okay? And we can do this by, we can show that this distinction finds a basis in linguistic practices, because in the first case, we would say here the first metafictional utterance, Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character. We okay, so I'll just make a back and forth here. The first example that I want to show here is metafictional utterance. The bottom one is a parafictional utterance. Let's consider, according to the fiction, Sherlock Holmes is a detective. So the evidence for the discursive commitment to the first one comes from the norms of fiction as an institution, whereas the evidence for the discursive commitment to the second one comes from the content of a work. So, but the first one uses what we would call an intersective use of the adjective, fictional. And the second one would use what we call this elliptical use of the operator, amounts to the privative or privative, I don't know how to pronounce this, the privative use of the same adjective. What are intersective uses and privative uses? Let's show an analogy. Here's an analogy. So, first, in broad terms, the intersective use, if X is an adjective and a noun, then we can infer that it is the adjective and the noun. For example, If X is a white duck, then we can infer that X is white and that X is a duck. But the privative use, on the other hand, if X is the adjective plus the noun, then we can infer that it is the adjective, but not the noun. For example, X is a rubber duck. We can infer that X is made of rubber, but not X is a duck. So we want to say that something similar occurs in fictional, in metafictional utterances and in parafictional utterances. For example, when we say Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character, we can infer that Sherlock Holmes is fictional, and we can infer that Sherlock Holmes is a character. This is a intersective use of the adjective. On the other hand, for a sort of parafictional-like, or strictly speaking, this, if we spell out the adjective here, we get a metafictional utterance. But okay, let's consider this something of a parafictional utterance with an implicit operator. So Sherlock Holmes is a detective so Sherlock Holmes is a fictional detective. We can infer that Sherlock Holmes is fictional, but not that he is a detective. So this is what we would call the privative use of the adjective. And in conclusion, a work of fiction, by attributing these fictional properties to fictional objects, generates sets of obligations and entitlements, much like Brandon would like. We are entitled to say, and we are entitled and obliged to say that Raskolnikov is a murderer and not a unicorn, and to describe him as a fictional character. What kinds of properties can be attributed to a fictional character? Well, the ones that are ascribed in a work of fiction via privative uses of the adjective, and those related to the metaphysics of fiction via the intersective uses of the adjective. In other words, the things we always do. That's what we hope that happens. I mean, we hope that our distinction really has some basis in something that's in inferential practices that are already present in natural languages. We are here suggesting that it is a unified account, in that it's not a hybrid account, so it should be virtuous in that sense. And finally, I think it avoids revisionism about the way we talk about fiction. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jerzy. Thank you, Italo, for the excellent presentation. So now for the question session, we have 7 minutes. So anyone can raise your hands. We have first Nate, followed by Sam and Alberto and Leclerc.
Thanks. I think actually Sam had his hand up first. Okay, Sam's being very kind.
Sorry.
I very much like the paper. I'm a fan of Brandon also, and it's very interesting how you brought him in here. I have maybe a friendly amendment or just a question, whether, very small point, whether you really want to say that Brandon licenses metaphysical versus pragmatic talk. So I don't know whether he really wants to say that we're talking about the metaphysics of abstract objects, or ficta, as opposed to the pragmatics of speaking about them. It seems that they're just two different kinds of practices. So it's pragmatic all the way down. Especially if you read more of Brandon. I'm working through his book on Hegel right now, and metaphysics just follows from pragmatics, I think. So just a terminological thought.
Thanks, that's a great point. I was thinking about that, but yes, I think we should incorporate that into the paper.
Yeah, I think the matter is that our account is metaphysics first in some sense. I mean, the reason why we are entitled to say that Holmes is detective is because, first of all, there is such a thing as Sherlock Holmes as an abstract artifact. But I think you're totally correct when you say that. I mean, we have to find a way in order to flatten the levels we're calling metaphysical and pragmatical and see what should give in this account. That's a great suggestion.
That was great. Thanks so much, you guys. I'm troubled by the having holding distinction. It's always neat to think about ways that we might be a fictional realist and kind of get away from it. I guess the thing I was sort of worried about, where it's like there's a certain flavor of ad hocery to the have and holding distinction, kind of wherever you go. I think about sort of the nuclear extranuclear distinction for like the kind of Parsonian Meinongian, that feels weirdly ad hoc. How do you decide where the nuclear sorts into the extranuclear? And then I was just thinking about, there's always a bump in the rug somewhere, and the putative distinction between intersective and privative uses of fictional. I'm just wondering, don't you have to posit a pretty remarkably fine-grained sorting of predicates with regard to that? So I'm just thinking about predicates like, is fictionally famous? Like, does famous activate the privative versus the intersective? And, I'm thinking about Sherlock Holmes being famous both in the fiction and then being fictionally famous. It's weird to posit that that's a sort of semantic distinction when it's highly contingent, because we can imagine Sherlock Holmes never becoming famous. I just kind of, I wanted to know a little bit more about how the sort of the fictional, the conception of the ambiguity sort of expands out, not ambiguity, but expands out to a broader class of predicates.
I'd say that when you say fictionally famous, you mean he is famous in the fiction?
I'm sort of asking you insofar as we can imagine, like there's circumstances in which Holmes, it's true according to fiction that he's famous, but of course he's also fictionally famous, but he could well have not been fictionally famous. So it's not clear that it sort of blocks us from inferring from Holmes being fictionally famous that he's both famous according to fiction as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd analyze the sentence, he's fictionally famous, even though we don't have an adjective, we don't have the fictional adjective as an adjective there. We could say he is a fictional famous person, let's say. Okay.
Yeah,
so that would be a that would be a privative use, and it would fit into it could be a property ascribed to the character, and it would happen via the privative use. Yes. So, but I agree that the distinction has to fall elsewhere. Of course, it's an intuitive distinction, but we are trying to get rid of the metaphysically ad hoc part of it and try to stick to the inferential practices that are already present in the language. But I have to think more about this example.
Yeah, and at the same time, I think we have no issues in saying that Sherlock Holmes is a famous fictional character. It's a property that Sherlock Holmes has. And if, according to the story, Holmes is famous, then it is fictionally famous. So this is a privative use, because it wouldn't make it like really famous outside of the story. But I have no problem in saying that Holmes is a fictional character, and Holmes is a fictional character that is famous in this case, because it really is. Don't you think?
I'll follow up with you guys.
So I think we only have time for one more question. So in my order, Professor Voltolini.
Thanks a lot, both. Yes, this distinction between intersective and privative predication is very interesting. I just wonder whether, in point of fact, your version is actually a variant of Zalta's version. For if you accept an equivalence between a sentence like Holmes is a fictional character and in the fiction, Holmes is a character, since Zalta also says that the last sentence is equivalent to the sentence Holmes encodes being a detective, then you get that all the sentences are true in one and the same way. So you get the sentence, the original sentence that you wanted to distinguish from, say, Holmes is a detective or Raskolnikov is a murderer, that you wanted to distinguish from the sentence Raskolnikov is a fictional murderer or Holmes is a fictional detective, actually come exactly to the same point.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, our motivation is the same as Zalta's in the sense we just don't want to take for granted his theory of objects, in the sense that we say that fictional objects exist And for Zauta, fictional objects don't exist because they are abstract. It's his definition of the discussion. But we want to get the same results as Zauta and Inwagen in this sense. We want to say that, I mean, when Zauta says that Sherlock Holmes exemplifies the property of being a fictional character, we want to say that's perfectly fine. And when he says that Holmes encodes the property of being a detective, we want to say, well, that is not really the case because Sherlock Holmes is an abstract artifact. So how can Holmes investigate something like a murder? It's not in space and time. It can't causally interact with anything. But at the same time, on the pragmatic level, we want some entitlement to say that, yes, when you say that Holmes is a detective, I understand what you're saying. If I say that Holmes is an astronaut, it might be something off here because parafictionally speaking, we have no entitlement to say such a thing. And I think that our contribution goes with the following comparison. Let's say that I have a rubber duck on the table. If someone says that something like, could you pass me the rubber elephant? We would have said something wrong. It's not a rubber elephant, it's a rubber duck, even though a rubber duck is not a duck. So analogously, we want to say that if someone says, oh, Sherlock Holmes is a fictional astronaut, well, that's false. Sherlock Holmes is a fictional detective, even though on the metaphysical side of the story, we can say that it really is a detective because Holmes is a fictional detective in the same sense that the duck in my example is a rubber duck, not a real duck in the relevant sense. I think that's it. And thank you for the question.
Thank you for your questions. We can continue the discussion after this session. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you very much. And now we have Nathaniel Goldberg. Excellent. You're already sharing your screen. I'm going to introduce you in a few words. Awesome. So right now we have Nathaniel Goldberg. He's a professor of philosophy at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. He has published 3 books, including Revising Fiction, Fact, and Faith, co-authored with Chris Geveler in 2020. And he's going to present the contributed paper, Referentialism, Discarded Science and Fiction.
Thank you very much, Jerzy, Italo, and everybody. This has been a wonderful conference, and I'm proud to speak after you and to speak before Professor Jablo. So consider 2 different kinds of texts. First, in his 1937 novel, The Hobbit, Tolkien described Bilbo Baggins as the hobbit who went on an adventure involving a wizard, dragon, and magic ring. Enchanting his readers and publishers in his 1954-55 trilogy of novels, The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien described Bilbo's nephew and adopted heir Frodo as going on an adventure to destroy the ring. So it's actually a serial work, as Sam was talking about earlier. So is this second text. In his 1859 correspondence to the French Academy of Sciences, it's a familiar example, Urbain Le Verrier described Vulcan, a name introduced by Jacques Babinet 13 years prior, is the planet that explained a perturbation in Mercury's orbit. Over the next half century, scientists and journalists published articles about the planet. The Vulcan was never observed, and in 1916, the perturbation, so-called, was explained away with Einstein's theory of general relativity. Novels are works of fiction, while scientific announcements and articles are works of fact. This is so even those scientific works can be incorrect, as those concerning Vulcan were. This too should be familiar. Consider 2 different accounts of names about reference and meaning called descriptivism, the first set, where a name refers, if it does so indirectly through some kind of mediation, and the name's meaning just is what those mediators are. According to descriptivism, one might think the name Bilbo does not refer to an actual hobbit because there are none. This isn't problematic, however, because the description, the hobbit who went on an adventure involving a wizard, dragon, and magic ring, can account for its meaning. Likewise, though Vulcan does not refer to an actual planet because there is none, it nevertheless means, a descriptivist might say, the planet that explained a perturbation in Mercury's orbit. Second, call referentialism, or sometimes millionism, any view according to which a name, if it refers, does so directly. and the name's meaning is its referent. Traditionally, referentialism has thought to create problems for names like Bilbo and Vulcan because they're often thought to refer to nothing. Therefore, curiously, they turn out to be synonyms because they refer to the same thing, namely nothing. And there are many ways around this. My goal in this short talk is to provide a referentialist account of names in fiction and in correct science that respects basic intuitions about them. And I do so apologetically, very programmatically, by using different aspects of different accounts of reference fiction and incorrect science. So first I want to start, and I'm going to skip around programmatically, starting with Kripke. Though referentialism traces to John Stuart Mill, if not earlier to Thomas Reid, Saul Kripke is the most influential referentialist, and his application of the view to science is well known. At some point, Kripke claims someone came into causal contact with the token of gold, his paradigm example, and baptized it with the name gold or whatever the name was in that person's language, thereby rigidly designating anything sharing its essence, both other tokens, all of which are concrete, as well as the type gold, which is abstract. Subsequent uses of the name tracing causally back to the baptism used the name gold to rigidly designate gold also. And this is so even though present descriptions associated with the name, for example, the element with atomic number 79, might have been previously unknown, and past, present, and future descriptions, including the one I just gave, might turn out to be incorrect. Gold nevertheless refers to and means gold regardless. Now, Kripke's application of referentialism to names in fiction, at least understood metafictionally, is similar to and different from this. So de-emphasizing the pretense part of the hybrid view and the metafictional referentialist point, Kripke, I think, would say in 1937, Tolkien published a novel in which he baptized the Hobbit who went on an adventure involving a wizard, dragon, and magic ring with the name Bilbo, thereby rigidly designating any object sharing its essence, whether or not there are other types or tokens. Though writing and publishing are causal acts, and so Tolkien came into causal contact with concrete tokens of the book, he did not come into causal contact with Bilbo. According to Kripke, Bilbo is abstract, as we've heard. Regardless, subsequent uses of the name, tracing causally back to the baptismal use, rigidly designate Bilbo, the individual. And this is so even though the present descriptions associated with the name might have been previously unknown by someone not having read the book, and past, present, and future descriptions might turn out to be incorrect, as Tolkien himself revealed in Lord of the Rings when explaining that the description of the Hobbit of how Bilbo acquired the magic ring was incorrect. Bilbo necessarily, the name, refers to and means Bilbo, regardless. Kripke argues for referentialism based on intuitions about how names function. While his account applied to science may or may not be intuitive, there are two reasons to think that applied to fiction it's not. First, that Bilbo is an abstract object seems unintuitive. Abstract objects don't causally interact with anything, as we've heard, yet Bilbo did so when he went on an adventure. Second, that Bilbo is an actual hobbit, abstract or otherwise, I think is also unintuitive because there are no actual hobbits. Hobbits don't actually exist. Now, I propose programmatically keeping Kripke's referentialism while abandoning his abstractionism and actualism by borrowing from the chief competitor of Kripke's account of fiction, or a chief competitor at the time, David Lewis's. And David Lewis, I don't think has got much mention in this conference, though for what it's worth, he was Brandam's mentor. So David Lewis argues that a fictional story is told as known fact in a merely possible world. For it to be so told, the story must be true in that world. Hence, for Lewis, whatever else it is, fiction is true in a merely possible world. Finally, while there's only one actual world, there's infinitely many possible ones. Only some worlds to which actual fictional texts refer, only some of those texts refer to them. Call those merely possible worlds to which fiction refers fictional worlds. Because actual fictional texts refer to them, the worlds themselves are actually fictional. They differ from merely fictional worlds to which merely fictional texts, such as, say, the sequel to Lord of the Rings that Tolkien never published, refer. Hence, according to Lewis, The Hobbit refers to one actually fictional world, and the name Bilbo refers to a concrete object in it. Rather than abstract and actual, as per Kripke, Bilbo turns out to be concrete and merely possible. Now, Lewis's account differs in another way also. The name Bilbo refers, I believe, via descriptions, yet Lewis's descriptivism is excisable. The account of fiction that I propose borrows from Lewis only selectively. Hence, starting with Kripke and selectively borrowing from Lewis, the account is this. Fiction refers to merely possible, actually fictional worlds. The name Bilbo refers to merely possible, actually fictional object. And the name Bilbo refers directly to and means Bilbo. Right. Moreover, this suggests a similar account of science. A factual text refers to the actual world because there are no such things as alternative facts. There are no such things as alternative factual worlds. The actually factual world is the actual world. Fact and therefore science refers to the actually factual world. So the name gold refers to an actually factual object. And it does so directly and means gold. Kripke mentions the name Vulcan, but says nothing definitive about it. Scott Soames, authoring the definitive development, I take it, of Kripke's referentialist view, endorses Nathan Salmon's application of referentialism to Vulcan and incorrect science generally. That makes Salmon's application the natural and indeed causal successor to Kripke's referentialism. According to Salmon, Leverrier's use of Vulcan is metaphysically analogous to Kripke's, but not Lewis's or my take on the name Bilbo. Vulcan is an actual abstract object. Vulcan is not, however, intentionally analogous to Bilbo. According to Salmon, Leverrier intended Vulcan, the name, to be like gold, the name, but unknown to him, it was instead like the name Bilbo. That's because Leverrier intended scientifically to explain an observable phenomenon, but likewise unknown to him, instead he told a story. Salmon's way of managing this metaphysical analogy and intentional disanalogy is to understand Bilbo and Vulcan both as abstract, but the former as fictional and the latter as mythological. Fiction, Salmon explains, is pretended to be true, while myth is believed to be true but is really false. So Vulcan, the planet, is abstract, actual, and mythological. And I'm sorry, you can probably see my chat was open. And I no need to, there we go. So there are two reasons I find Salmon's account unintuitive. The first is that Vulcan is abstract and actual seems unintuitive. Abstract objects are not studied by astronomers, yet Vulcan was. Further, had Vulcan actually existed, then it would have perturbed Mercury's orbit and there would have been concrete. Following Lewis's own analysis of counterfactuals, Vulcan therefore does perturb Mercury's orbit in the possible world closest to the actual world where Vulcan does exist concretely. Second, that Vulcan is mythological also is unintuitive. Myths are not scientific. They do not advance hypotheses empirically testable by predictions, at least they don't do so routinely or chiefly. Chiefly, they advance lessons, warnings, and wisdom. Mythology is closer to religion than to science, and for what it's worth, the United States Library of Congress catalogs mythology under the classification BL for religions mythology. So I propose keeping Salmon's referentialism while abandoning his abstractionism, actualism, and mythologism by borrowing ironically from Salmon's own account of merely possible objects. So on my account so far, fiction refers to a merely possible, actually fictional world. Science refers to the actually factual world. Hence, correct science refers to the actually factual world correctly. Incorrect science then would refer to the actually factual world incorrectly. There I have it. So because anything that refers to one world incorrectly refers to a world once modally removed correctly, incorrect science refers to a merely possibly factual world correctly. Now consider Leverrier's texts and those of other journalists and scientists concerning Vulcan. The world to which they refer is merely possible because the texts are incorrect. General relativity proved that. The world is also possibly factual because the texts are scientific rather than fictional or mythological. Leverrier appealed to a scientific theory that was empirically falsified. The theory did not thereby cease being scientific. Indeed, the United States Library of Congress catalogs books written about Vulcan under the classification QB for astronomy. And Salmon himself shows how that can be consistent with referentialism. According to Salmon, speakers can baptize future objects. He gives an example from David Kaplan, the example of the name Newman, taken to refer to the first baby born in the 22nd century. He also says we can baptize merely possible objects. He gives his own example of Nothin, referring to the person who would have arisen from the same ovum but different sperm from which Salmon himself arose. Taking advantage of Salmon's referentialist account, I'm almost there. I can say that Vulcan refers to the planet that would have explained the perturbation of Mercury's orbit had it existed. Hence, Vulcan refers to a merely possible, possibly factual planet. Nor did Leverrier write mythology. He wrote about science that turned out to be incorrect, bringing this back to Bilbo. So Bilbo, we might say, refers to and means Bilbo, who's merely possible and actually fictional. Vulcan, again, refers to, directly means Vulcan, who's, as I have up there, merely possible and possibly factual. So they turn out not to be synonyms, and we have a referentialist account. Extremely programmatic. Hopefully they're questions. I thought I would anticipate some objections. As I see, I've got 4 minutes-ish to do so, maybe a little bit more. So here's some objections. My aim was to provide a referentialist account of names in fiction and incorrect science that respects basic intuitions about them. Objection 1, that merely possible objects go on adventures or perturb orbits is also unintuitive. So my referentialist account fares no better than Kripke's or Salmon's. Now, on the contrary, I want to say merely possible objects neither go on adventures nor perturb orbits. In a merely possible, actually fictional world, Bilbo went on an adventure. And in a merely possible, possibly factual world, Vulcan perturbed Mercury's orbit. But no merely possible object went on an adventure or actually perturbed an orbit. Objection 2. My disagreement with Salmon is merely verbal. What he calls myth, I've been calling incorrect science. 2 replies. First, for reasons already explained, Salmon would be wrong to regard those as co-referential terms. Second, incorrect science could have been correct science. That makes its objects merely possible and often concrete, while for Salmon, they would have been actual and always abstract. So a big picture way of putting it is, I think mine is the first paper at this conference to argue for a kind of realism that's not a kind of artifactualism. It's a kind of realism that treats Ficta as concrete, but merely possible. So objection 3, and I've got one more after this. Because I've spoken of science as a special case of fact, and also of incorrect science, I've licensed speaking of quote unquote incorrect fact, which is contradictory. There are again 2 replies. First, if science remains science whether correct or not, then facts should remain facts whether correct or not. To think otherwise seems contradictory. But second, phrase incorrect fact, maybe I can get rid of that as well and just understand that facts that turn out to be incorrect. I don't think that's contradictory, and it seems less unintuitive than Salmon's claim that things thought to be facts turned out to be myths. Final objection, it's a bit of a longer one, and I guess I close on this. Even if Salmon is right that referentialism can be applied to merely possible objects, I appeal to Kripke's particular version of referentialism, which cannot. And I've called referentialism any view, concerning reference and meaning of names, but Kripke, of course, is a causalist. Referentialism is a causal theory. So a name refers because it traces causally back to some initial baptism. Yet baptizers cannot come into account with merely possible objects. And there are three reinforcing reasons to think that they can, and this response doesn't succeed. First, I'm after a referentialist account of names and incorrect science, and I'm not so sure that the causal account is necessarily part of it. Second, Kripke's referentialist account of fiction already allows coming into causal contact with abstracta. And third, and I think this is often not appreciated, Kripke's version of referentialism applied to science, correct science, as a non-causal component too. According to Kripke, whoever baptized gold baptized all tokens of gold, even those with which they did not come into causal contact, and baptized the type gold, which abstract, no one could have come into causal contact. Hence, not only don't I need a causal component, but Kripke's own referentialism applied to fiction and correct science allows us not to have non-causal interaction. Wow, I spoke really quickly. Thanks. It probably shouldn't have popped that dark chocolate right before I started speaking.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nathaniel. So, Professor Yablo. Maybe there we go.
Yeah. Thanks. That was so interesting. So I wanted to say something in support of your reply to the last objection to do with referentialism, which is that Kripke does allow that there can be names of objects that we don't come into causal contact with if we have, including abstract objects. So he gives the example of pi as a name for, you know, a certain real number, and how do we manage to refer to pi? Well, via a reference fixing description, the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter. And similarly, you could say, and this is where I get to my other point, that we fix the reference of, say, Vulcan as, and you suggest this at one point, the planet that would have explained the perturbations had a planet explain the perturbations. So here's my real question. There isn't a unique planet that would have explained the perturbations. Any number of planets could have done so. So why do we have the impression that there's a, you know, that, or how do you reconcile that with the idea that Vulcan is the name of a unique planet? Just as Kripke says about Holmes, any number of people could have satisfied the Holmes stories. Any number of planets could have satisfied the Vulcan theory. That's
Sure.
Thanks.
Sure. No, thank you. That's a great question. So I was speaking quickly. I also, maybe too elliptically, was trying to appeal, I'll say elliptically, to David Lewis's own account of counterfactuals. And if I lean heavily on that, maybe I can say with Lewis that I'm concerned with that possible world closest to the actual world in which Vulcan does explain the perturbation. And in that case, there would be one possible world that did it, the world picked out by the description, you know, that closest world in which Vulcan does describe it. So I have just one singular Vulcan.
Lewis wouldn't say that. Stollicher would.
Oh, then I am happy to be corrected.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Sam?
That was great. Yeah, I think there's this weird history of the case for sort of modal realism where you run it back and Lewis actually gives these kind of intentional arguments like, no, we need to double down on making sense of intentional phenomena, and that's why we should believe in worlds. So it's kind of fun to sort of envision this kind of alternative history for the case for possibilism. And I think the one word that just emerges is this question about determinacy, which is a big intuition to give up, right? Like if you think about possibilia as serving as the contents of our fictional thought and talk, we get this radical indeterminacy. We can engage in sort of techniques like supervaluation over them, but on the one hand, you get that kind of loss of apparent determinacy, which is a pretty significant intuition of fiction. But I guess the more salient one is just this intuition that we create fictional characters, and that's one that pretty resoundingly has to be surrendered if we go the possibilist route. The third one, which is just a return to sort of Hannah's point from the other day, boy, this doesn't help us when it comes to impossible fictions. So when it comes to the kind of determinacy worry, the creatability worry, and then the sort of impossibility worry, I'm just kind of, when I worry about it, those are the ones I chiefly sweat about. Do you have a kind of rank order, or does some not leave you?
Sure. Well, I can try to answer them. You'll let me know whether they're to your satisfaction. So to the impossibility worry, I take it that that's only a worry if we limit our ontology to logically possible worlds. And maybe we shouldn't. Lewis does, and he gives reasons for that. But I was persuaded by Anna's talk that fiction contains contradictions, and I don't think that that's reason to discount it as fictional. So maybe not satisfying, but that's my intuition. The possible worlds can, contra Lewis, include impossible possible worlds. To the creatability worry, yeah, we all have to bite bullets. And it might just be that it's functionally equivalent to say that my creation of a fictional character was actually the discovery of a merely possible character that could have existed. In fact, Tolkien says exactly or something very much like that, right? The Lord of the Rings was a translation of an actual book, he claims, that he, as translator, discovered. And I know not probably most fiction writers don't say that. In some ways, though, it does match the phenomenology of fiction writing, I think. It seems to authors that they are tapping into some story. And to some of them, it seems that they're tapping into some story that's out there for them to record. I'm bullet biting on the further worry that that doesn't capture all the phenomenology. And then finally, Sam, I'm sorry, could you repeat the determinacy worry, because I wasn't typing fast enough?
So if you take a description that we would take to indicate a fictional character, that's going to be radically indeterminate with respect to infinite many possible beings. So there's infinitely many possible Frodos, standard way you supervaluate over Frodos, but
absolutely
underlying it,
Yeah, absolutely. So this is my intuitions we've already discovered are cockeyed compared to lots of people's, maybe especially compared to yours, Sam, but I'm less worried about this because I'm not so sure, as Hannah and I were talking about the other day, in the case of history, we're not already doing that. So when we describe Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, we are, I think, just referring to one Julius Caesar, but it's indeterminate whether he crossed it in 5 hours or 5 hours and 1 minute. Maybe even in the non-historical subjects, maybe even when we describe, I don't know, climate change or climate change models, there's indeterminacy. Maybe even in more mundane examples, like I say, there's a beer in my refrigerator. Maybe I have in mind, maybe it's not clear what brand beer I'm talking about. So I guess I'm willing to bite that bullet, that indeterminacy infects more than just fictional discourse, but that doesn't mean there's not a fact of the matter. It might mean that we can't always pick it out or don't always have epistemic access to it.
awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
Great. So Professor Voltolini.
Thank you very much, Nat. I think that I agree with most part of what you said, in particular with respect to Vulcan, that I take to be a possible object as well. This, by the way, may solve the problem of how can we ascribe properties to it, because definitely Vulcan has not actually the property of orbitating around the sun. It has the property of possibly orbitating around the sun. But precisely this reason brings me some perplexity as to the idea that fictional objects can be treated as possible objects as well, because if this were the case, so the property that we ascribe to fictional objects would be possessed by such objects only in possible worlds, and this would hardly explain how can we be moved by them. For instance, Anna Karenina, I'm moved by Anna Karenina because she actually committed a suicide. If she were just a possible suicidal, so to speak, I would not be so moved. I'm definitely not moved by Hitler because he might be a benefactor. The fact that Hitler is a possible benefactor does not move me at all, for instance. And the same should hold with respect to Anna Karenina. Is this a worry for you?
So again, my intuitions might be different, but let me give you an example. I could have had possible relatives at my wedding. It's an autobiographical example. I could have, but because of things in my family history, I didn't have those relatives because of World War II and other things like this. I think I and my mother, I think, were moved by the thought that we had such a small family and that it was possible that we could have had more people there, but we didn't. I think that's a case where we are moved by possibilia. And I think that can apply to the case of Anna and Anna Karenina. But that's a great question.
Awesome. So we still have time for one more quick question, at least formally, because then we have the coffee break or argumentative break. You never know. But Hannah?
Oh, no. Okay, I'll be quick. So thank you for the talk. My questions piggybacking off of Sam's, I think, were similar indeterminacy worries, but not about particular individuals like Frodo, but say there's just some fictional fact of the matter, but the facts are ambiguous. So the example is something like, after the lecture, students surrounded Hannah at the lectern, right? It's ambiguous how many students or what kinds of students, but there's still a fictional truth that's created. And I feel like, I don't think we would say there's a fictional character as a group that's created. That's just too too ambiguous, but is possible objects kind of way of understanding it going to capture that fictional truth? I mean, are you just going to range over like a set of possible worlds, or how would you go about accounting for that? So that was my general worry about using possible objects as a framework to understand all fictional truths.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a question we had talked about the other day. So I guess my intuition the other day was to range over possible worlds. But let me say that I guess, Sam, I was unfair in my response to you when I said that there was a fact of the matter, we just didn't have epistemic access to it. Because Hannah, your point is, because fictional objects are underdetermined, we don't have a maximal set of properties. We can't say that there's a unique object. I guess I would have to say that we are ranging over a set of possible worlds, and that the name Frodo is referring to more than one object, because the book Lord of the Rings is referring to more than one world. And yeah, that becomes uncomfortable. And my weasel way out was to say we seem to do things like this in science and in other discourse as well. But to your point, still there's a fact of the matter. Yes, I guess another bullet that I'm going to bite. There's a disanalogy there.
Awesome. So thank you very much. This is the end of our contributor paper session. And in 28 minutes, we're having the closing conference for this colloquium, which is going to be delivered by Professor Steven Yablo. That's called Conditions